everybody. Welcome. It's so great to see such a full house for this fascinating discussion today. My name's Maud Mandel. I'm Dean of the College here at Brown, but I'm a professor of history and Judaic studies, and really coming in that capacity to introduce us to today's discussion and to our panelists. I'm going to serve as moderator, of course. It's a great pleasure to serve in this role. And so I'm going to do introductions right now for everybody. I'll play kind of sort of timekeeper and do the things that a moderator does. But before turning to those matters, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to give a few words of my own about the book we're going to be discussing and its author. I also want to just say, by way of apology, if you see me checking my phone, it's because my watch broke today. I'm not actually checking emails, so if I'm keeping time, it's because I'm looking on this, not because I'm drifting off into Dean of the College business on my email. So first to our author. So if you are here, you saw the poster for today's events where all the bios are listed, and I'm certainly not going to rehash the details of the illustrious career of our guest of honor who we're celebrating today. With that said, I can't resist the urge to say a few words about Omer and the book we will be discussing before I turn it over to everyone here. So as I'm sure all of you know, Omer Bartov is the John P. Birkeland Distinguished Professor of European History at Brown. I, however, met Omer before either of us were at Brown when I was a graduate student, and he was a professor at Rutgers University, at a conference he organized at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. on genocide and religion. And in fact, he actually published my very first substantive essay as a scholar, which I will say really was a reflection at this early point of the colleague he would become, but once we were both together at Brown many years later. Of course, we didn't know it at the time, which is to say supportive, encouraging, and most importantly, really willing to engage and debate and examine the subjects we shared in common from all angles. And one of the things I think that's really marked my now very long relationship with Omer, it's gone on for a long time, we both have been here for many years, he takes ideas and history seriously. He loves to talk about it. He's one of the few people I felt comfortable arguing with at a fairly young age. And I've learned so much from those conversations over the years. Omer is curious, interested, and interesting. And he has a keen historical mind which he brings to all of the topics he takes up. And so much of this energy has been evident actually quite recently in the collective projects he's undertaken here at the Watson Institute, first on the Eastern European borderlands, which the collective international project focusing on the regions of Europe torn apart in the first half of the 20th century, and now in the history of the land and people of Israel. His interest in whatever he is considering is infectious and insightful, and also deeply humane, which means that although he's studying some of the most complex, violent moments in the 20th century, his approach is empathetic to his subjects in the sense that he really allows us to see through their eyes. And the Anatomy of Genocide, to which I will now briefly turn, epitomizes this accomplishment. When I was thinking about what I wanted to say about this book today, what kept coming to my mind this is going to be a funny thing to say, but what kept coming to my mind is this is a book that's really about human beings. Now, again, this seems a little odd to say, since, of course, by definition, the study of history is the study of human beings, about their relationships with each other, the environments in which they live, the contexts in which they live, the societies they build and destroy. But Anatomy of a Genocide is a book that takes as its historical subject one of the most painful episodes of modern history and really shows the humanity of its origins and outcome. Now, don't get me wrong, the book does not trace the humane. And yet, both in its framing, in its testament to the author's own mother, and in its approach, Anatomy of a Genocide says something fundamental about human beings. And even the very title, Anatomy, takes us metaphorically to the humanity of the topic and argument. How, Omer asks, can neighbors and friends turn on each other? How can one town, seemingly peaceful, if not convivial, unravel with such speed and violence? An Anatomy of a Genocide does that by examining the long-standing and multi-generational relationships stretching across time that existed among the primary peoples that made up the region, Poles and Jews and Ukrainians, in the town of Buczacz, really over hundreds of years, in the language he long calls the biography of a town, before the war unfolded and neighbors turned upon each other. And really in doing this, what's so fascinating about this approach is he takes us to some of the questions that are at the key, really at the heart of the study of the history of the Holocaust, namely some of really the categories we use in this history when we teach it and when we talk about it, bystanders, and collaborators, victims, and he really unpacks these by looking at people through their eyes and around them. So it turns out some of these categories just really don't exist. The category of bystanders, which was really a kind of mainstay of the historiography of the Holocaust. When you read this book, you really come away thinking, yeah, there weren't bystanders. That's not actually a category we can even use anymore. I certainly would never, if I were teaching my History of the Holocaust course this year, use that word ever again. And other such insights around the people, the victims, the collaborators who lived in this environment. And so he does all of this, contributing to the historiography, really while never losing sight of the individuals who were lost to us at that moment. And I think that is really the big, tremendous accomplishment of this work, or one among many. So with that introduction of the work, I want to turn to the panelists. Again, I'm not actually, I hope you read all the bios, and I never think it's very interesting when I'm sitting in an audience to read them out loud to you after you've read them. So I just want to say a couple of quick things to kind of situate why I think we have this group of people here to talk about this topic. I'm going to go in alphabetical order, not in the order they're sitting, because that's how they're listed, and that's the way we'll go in the program as well. So we have Laura Jacquesh here, who is the Albert Abramson Assistant Professor of Holocaust Studies at Brandeis. And I'm going to really simplify as I kind of let you see why we have different people here, what they sort of represent, if you will. So much of her research and teaching focuses on European Jews, both before, during, and after World War II. She's really interested in the retributive justice after war, on the origins of the historiography and how of the Holocaust and how Jews told this history. And on our panel, she is representing, if you will, Jewish history, as am I, but I'm not playing that role today, and the perspective of the victims in this process and the voices of those victims in this book. David Kurtzer, I hope many of you know. He's the Paul Dupuy University Professor of Social Science and a Professor of Anthropology and Italian Studies at Brown, and of course our former provost. He's also a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and a longtime friend and colleague at our university. As a Europeanist and somebody who's worked on the history of anti-Semitism and Jews from a historian's perspective, Professor Kurtzer is deeply knowledgeable about all the subjects we'll be discussing today. But I actually, when I was thinking about sort of what each of these scholars represents, I think also what I would like to emphasize about Professor Kurtzer is that he is a storyteller as well. He is very interested in narrative and how historians tell stories. And I think we'll have some really interesting insights for us for thinking about that, about the way stories and historical narratives are told. And lastly, our third speaker and guest is Professor Eric Weiss, who's a distinguished professor of history at the City College of New York. And he is an internationally renowned scholar of genocide, although I think right now working on a book on the history of human rights and nation states, if I understand it. And he comes to us, as I say, a scholar of German history, of European history, of Weimar Germany in particular, and of comparative genocide, which I think also will help situate us in the scholarship on genocide and of the Holocaust and World War II in particular. So without further ado, and after those introductions, I will now, as I said, we will go alphabetically, and I'll gently nudge our speakers between the 10 to 15 minute range, because we want to leave plenty of time at the end for your questions. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Maud, for the introduction, and Omer for inviting me. I'm very happy and honored to have the opportunity to read Omer Bartov's brilliant book, Anatomy of a Genocide. I very much enjoyed reading this extraordinary piece of scholarship and writing, even if I found its narrative deeply unsettling and moving. The comments that I will offer are very much from my angle as a historian of the Jews in the 20th century and historian of the Holocaust. As I was reading Anatomy of a Genocide, I also reread, in preparation of one of my classes, the book The Treatment of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, which is a collection of 150 eyewitness accounts on the Armenian genocide. It was published by the British Foreign Office about a century ago, just a good century ago, in 1916. What struck me about the volume was not just those horrifying accounts, but rather that the British editors, the historian and Labour politician James Bryce and his young assistant, the historian Arnold J. Toynbee, gave a lengthy justification for why they included the testimony of Armenian victims. After all, they argued, victims of atrocities were too emotionally invested to be objective, and victims of quote-unquote Oriental races in particular had a natural tendency to use hyperbolic language. Still, the editors thought that victim accounts were admissible if they were contextualized with the neutral, quote-unquote, neutral accounts from the numerous European bystanders who witnessed the Armenian genocide. Now, it is certainly striking to read these inhibitions over the use of victim testimony 100 years later, at an age when victims and survivors of mass atrocities enjoy public standing and moral authority. And it was particularly striking in the context of reading Anatomy of a Genocide, which captures and analyzes the voices of the victims so lucidly. It is also striking that for several decades, and that's from my perspective, as someone who's worked on the genesis of Holocaust historiography, the academic study of the Holocaust built on the documents, ideas, policies, and voices of the Nazi perpetrators at the expense of the voices of their victims. And that although Holocaust survivors who engaged in Holocaust research immediately after the liberation from Nazi rule, as, for example, the Polish Jewish historian Philip Friedman, who was not from Buczacz, but was still a Galicianer from Lemberg, had demanded that future scholarship pay close attention to the experiences and responses of Jews under Nazism and the ambivalent roles of non-Jewish bystanders, which had their roots in ethnic relations that predated the Nazi occupation. Yet it took decades until historians of the Holocaust would come to include those Jewish victims into those sources of the Jewish victims into the historical narratives on an equal footing with perpetrator and bystander sources. Anatomy of a Genocide is a brilliant synthesis of various historiographic trends that have crystallized in Holocaust and genocide studies over the past 2 decades and have not been previously brought in a conversation with each other. And let me highlight a few of these trends. Omer Bartov's book is integrated history at its best and in the fullest sense. In the mid-1990s, the Israeli historian Saul Friedlander had developed the concept of an integrated history of the Holocaust, which weaves together the voices and sources of the perpetrators with those of the victims. Throughout Bartov's book, the voices of victims, perpetrators, and bystanders are juxtaposed and woven into a complex and multi-layered narrative of ethnic coexistence, enmity, mass violence, and genocide. At the heart of the book is the Nazi murder of the Jewish population of Buczacz, and essentially it can be seen as a local history of the Holocaust. However, I think this would be really limiting the narrative. This history cannot be told, let alone understood, without anchoring it within the broader context of ethnic violence that long preceded and then even followed the Nazi mass murder of the Jews of Buczacz. It is a longue durée history of ethnic violence as seen through the lens of a single town. This local perspective allows a microhistory of the social dynamics between victims, perpetrators, and bystanders during the war and the genocidal violence, showing the overlapping layers of victimization of various ethnic groups. When there is a situation in which there is frequent political change of political rulers. Anatomy of a Genocide hence echoes the inter-ethnic violence described, for example, in Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands and the earlier work Neighbors by Jan Thomas Gross. Yet Bartov adds a new dimension by offering a perspective on the history of ethnic relations and inter-ethnic violence that is both locally focused and longue durée, a trajectory that is often missing from Holocaust histories that only focus on the years of the German occupation. In fact, Anatomy of a Genocide reminded me in many ways of Marcel Aufül's masterful documentary film Le Chagrin et la Pitié, The Sorrow and the Pity from 1969, which tells the history of France in the Second World War through the lens of a single town, Clermont-Ferrand, contrasting the accounts of a great variety of historical actors, be they German soldiers, French Nazi collaborators, denouncers, resistance fighters, political prisoners, forced laborers, persecuted Jews, or foreign diplomats. Bartov's book, too, juxtaposes the views of the perpetrators, victims, and bystanders, showing the complexities of the encounters of Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, Ruthenians, Russians, Soviets, Austrians, Germans, and Nazis. And the book analyzes a broad set of perpetrators of genocide who, over the course of time, can even change roles and positions, meaning that perpetrators of yesterday's occupation can become the victims of tomorrow's. And the chapter, German Order, sheds new light on the various Nazi perpetrators of Gestapo, SS, police, Wehrmacht, and civilian administration. Most of them are lesser-known figures with great significance in the local context. Bartov meticulously reconstructs their wartime interactions with their Jewish victims and their Ukrainian collaborators. The Germans who had come to their jobs in Buczacz out of their adherence to the Nazi project perpetrated genocide not just out of ideological commitment to the regime or out of peer pressure. Rather, most committed their crimes from a position of comfort while experiencing the good life and the unlimited power of Nazi occupiers. Some individuals also seem to have killed out of sheer sadistic pleasure. Here, Bartov's work very much complements the recent work of Thomas Kühne on male bonding and camaraderie among Nazi perpetrators who unite and bond through committing genocide. But what makes Bartov's description of the local Nazi henchmen so powerful is the fact that he also portrays them as family men, husbands, fathers, and lovers who lived at the site of their crimes with their wives and children. Bartov's attention to the female partners and companions then ties in with the recent work of Wendy Lower on female Nazi perpetrators and the role of women in the Nazi-occupied East. But Bartov's attention to women's history and gender extends well beyond the perpetrators. Anatomy of a Genocide pays close attention to female experiences of victimhood, especially rape and sexual violence, but also motherhood in extremis. Jewish children's voices are heard throughout the volume, thus contributing to a rich field of research on children in the Holocaust and child survivors that has developed internationally in the past decade. When discussing victims, the book also shows no inhibition to confront the gray zone, to use Primo Levi's famous term, between victims and perpetrators, of victims who collaborated with the perpetrators, addressing, for example, Jewish informers and the ambivalent behavior of Jewish councils and ghetto police. This is embedded in the broader analysis of collaboration and what it meant for different ethnic groups at different times in a location that changed hands among different rulers every couple of years. Likewise, the narrative addresses the multifaceted aspects of vengeance in the context of genocide. Bartov's account is also important for its questioning the very category of bystander. Maud already mentioned this part very convincingly, by showing that one way or another, bystanders were never uninvolved, whether they turned blind eye on the atrocities or whether they assisted the murderers or helped the victims. It was always an act of choice, an act of choice. Moreover, there is ample evidence in the book that the same people often acted in different capacities as rescuers and as abusers. Bartov's account is also remarkable for its use of a broad array of sources from perpetrators, victims, and I don't want to say it, but I will say it for lack of a better term, bystanders. I especially liked Bartov's use of German trial, or I should rather say investigation records, since most former Nazis were investigated but never tried, as a source to understand perpetrator behavior, and that he so scrupulously read this kind of evidence against the words of the victims, exposing how those former Nazis actually reconstructed and rationalized their supposedly innocent genocidal crimes. In short, Anatomy of a Genocide is a vivid, compelling, and at times breathtaking and unsettling account that shows once again that genocide is a very intimate, is an intimate event, as it is perpetrated among former acquaintances, neighbors, friends, classmates, colleagues, customers, students, and perhaps even lovers. The book is a very nuanced piece of scholarship. It is deeply personal without ever sentimentalizing or getting lost in the realm of the personal. And this book really made me want to read your current research already and thinking about your personal journey as a scholar from writing about Nazis at the Eastern Front, Nazi soldiers at the Eastern Front, and going through Buczacz towards now writing about Israel-Palestine. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity, and I look forward to the fruits of tomorrow.
Well, thanks to Omer for inviting me to participate, even if I'm not really an expert in this material. And in fact, I had great difficulty reading it, not because it's not a wonderful book, and it's a book that packs a real wallop, but there are parts of it that are just very difficult to read. And make a personal confession, I have an older adopted sister who's a sole survivor from Auschwitz, and I grew up anytime an image of a Nazi was on our little television, the television got turned off, and I still haven't even been able to see Schindler's List. So reading this book was not that easy for me. But the issues it deals with, the origins of interethnic and interreligious violence, our understanding of human nature, as you've gotten some sense already, and the nature of evil, I would add, could hardly be more important for us today, or sadly more relevant to our world. It's also, for me, compelling and interesting as a story of the Enlightenment path through the dark waters of nationalism, which gets to a larger set of debates as well. So what I'd like to do is just, in the few minutes I have, focus on 2 or 3 or 4 of these larger questions that I see so convincingly dealt with, but convincingly, again, not answering all our questions, which of course would be impossible to do with these broad issues. So these are not just historiographical controversies, although they are that, but they're also, I'd say, moral controversies. I mentioned the complex relationship between the human liberation that came with Europe's Enlightenment and the dark side of nationalism that in some respects replaced the old political glue that came with the Ancien Regime. Here we get to the debate over the Holocaust as a product of modernity. Bartov confronts some of these questions in his first chapter, where he tells us that in the first decades of the 20th century in Galicia, a new world was emerging. And here I'm quoting him. He said, as people began identifying themselves nationally and ideologically, they also looked at others through different eyes. distinguishing them not only by religion and ethnicity, but also by whether their history gave them the right to continue living where they were. Yet, and this I found interesting, Bartov adds, the path toward violence was neither foreseen nor inevitable. And I wonder about that, actually. I mean, that's certainly an optimistic reading of history. I'm not sure that's right, but be interested what others think. I mean, whether it could be foreseen is one thing, but whether it's inevitable in some sense, one might argue it was. Not, obviously, in the exact form it took. As Bartov shows, the violence, especially aimed at the Jews, was not something new to this part of the world. So, I mean, one of the things interesting for me was it wasn't, peaceful. We're all singing Kumbaya together, Ukrainians, Poles, and Jews, and then all of a sudden the nasty Nazis show up and there's violence. No, there's slaughter going on for decades there among different groups, including the Jews as victims. This leads me to another issue, the role of the churches in these developments. In some parts of the world, the story of the rise of nationalism as a basis of people's identity is this story of the displacement of religion. There's a study of the Balkans that comes to my mind, where in the 19th century, when people were asked their identity, they would have said, would have given a religious answer in, say, I'm Orthodox, I'm Catholic, I'm Muslim. But then in the 20th century, these same peoples or same populations would answer, no, I'm Croat, I'm Bosnian, I'm a Serb. Now, these new national identities, however, can't necessarily, as in these cases, be disentangled from religious identities. So there's this issue of, with the rise of these national identities, as Ukrainian and so on, how are they related to the old religious identities, and what role do these organized religious organizations, the churches, in particular the Orthodox and the Catholic Church here, play in all this, including in the violence? We have scattered mentions of the churches throughout the book. I'll just give a couple to help make the point. In 1930, on Polish Constitution Day, we were told it was, these are Omer's words, organized as a purely Polish and Roman Catholic event, complete with an open-air mass and a sermon by an army brigade chaplain. Or 1933, he tells of a Greek Catholic priest allegedly inciting 3 young Ukrainian women to paint the statue of St. Joseph in the center of the village with yellow and blue Ukrainian colors. And at one point, Bartov tells us, and again, I'm quoting him here, he says, these were all troubling signs that religion and nationalism were being fused together to produce an ideological and psychological climate ripe for widespread violence once the constraints on social order were removed or altered. But it's not an issue. He covers an awful lot of ground in these 300 or so pages, and so I'm hoping maybe in our conversation he might be able to say a little bit more about how he sees the role of religion and the churches in particular in this interethnic and interreligious violence and the form it took. A second question about human nature that arises from this book. The findings, I think, of the book are far from comforting for our view of human nature, to say the least. The depths of human depravity that are chronicled here are indeed chilling. What do we make of the fact that the Gestapo were able to recruit a brigade of Jewish police to assist them in expediting the murder of their fellow Jews? And if some Jews can be compelled to perform such a role, how, one might ask, can one be so critical of the Poles, Ukrainians, and others? And this is certainly one of the defenses used by perpetrators here. Clearly, I think there's an answer to that question. There were very different situations. But this image of the Jewish brigade helping lead the Jews to their murder is, that is painted in this book is really troubling. What Bartov also shows, that we heard Laura refer to, is the widespread butchery of the Jews in this area without any moral qualms of the perpetrators. And I found this interesting in the US with all the concern about what we call post-traumatic stress syndrome, whatever. that American soldiers going to Iraq and so on encounter, having witnessed the terrible things they witness, and this affecting them for life and making their lives difficult. We have the opposite picture here. Not that there weren't some people troubled by this, but in general, the picture that is painted here is, well, let me give you an example. Omer says, this normalization of murder, the removal of the Jews as part of a day's work, as entertainment, as background noise to the drinking bouts or amorous relationships, along with puzzlement at the Jews' conduct, mixed with anger at them for making it so easy to kill them. These were part and parcel of the German experience of genocide, rarely reflected in post-war representations and ruminations, let alone historiography. Shades of Goldhagen's book, of course, Danny Goldhagen's Hitler's Willing Executioner, that's been so criticized, but I'm sure he would see in this some basis for his claims. Omer wrote that most of the perpetrators killed thoughtlessly and displayed no pangs of conscience either then or decades later. So not just at the time, but even a decade later. I won't quote further, but you really, those of you who haven't gotten to read the book, you will see much troubling but very rich and I think important descriptions of exactly how the murder of the Jews takes place and with what lack of moral compunction, not just by the Germans, but by Ukrainians, Poles as well. This also brings to mind, of course, another concept that's well known that's come out of this world, namely the world of historiography, namely the banality of evil, which Hannah Arendt, of course, made famous in her book on the Eichmann trial. And there I think it was totally misplaced, and in fact, a real disservice to history, the application to Adolf Eichmann of this idea of banality of evil. But here, it seems to be perhaps apt. And Omer writes, the most striking feature of the men who murdered the Jewish community of Buczacz was a seemingly unbridgeable discrepancy between their mundane pre-war and post-war lives and the astonishing brutality, callousness, and disdain for humanity they displayed during the occupation. So they led this life as accountants and school teachers and butchers and whatnot beforehand, and then have this period of mass murder. I mean, they're taking out 1.5 million Jews and just shooting them in this part of Eastern Europe and the Russian border, and having them walk up to the pits where they are murdering small children and aged people, and do this without a qualm and go back to their life as local accountant. Third point, on collaboration and the remaking of history. There's been a lot of discussion in recent years of the invention of history, the remaking of history. And I'm sure you all saw the story just, a few days ago, but the Polish parliament, the lower house, passed a law, or at least did their part of passing a law, to make it a crime, punishable by, I think, up to 3 years in prison, of making a claim that Poles had anything to do with the mass murder of the Jews in Poland. And the New York Times, I think just 2 days ago, editorialized against this. So these issues are very much still with us. I'm sure your publicist, Simon Schuster, would be very happy. He should be called on to write some op-eds in the Times and whatnot about this point. Attempts in Eastern and Central Europe to cast the mass murder of the millions of Jews in the region as solely the work of the Germans, and to delink it from the ferocious history of local anti-Semitism in these lands, long predating the war, began before the last shots of Second World War were fired, and as I just mentioned, continue very much to this day. Omer details how the invading Germans were able to play the Ukrainians against the Poles and to organize them into police units under German command. In the last months of the German occupation, Bartov tells us, quote, many of the Jewish victims were murdered not by the Germans, but by an array of Ukrainian paramilitaries. And I think it's no coincidence, and there was some reference to this earlier, that one of the chapters you call Neighbors, of course, Jan Gross's book about this phenomenon in Poland, I'm sure it was at least in part in your mind in doing that, where, again, a focus on a particular community. This one in Poland, where the 1,600 Jews or so of this community before the Nazis get there, round them up, put many of them in a barn, set it on fire, and murder them all. Their neighbors, their previous, Catholic neighbors, do this to the 1,600 Jews of their community that they've been living with. In both cases, despite all the complaints about a surfeit of Holocaust memorials that we hear, the Holocaust has actually produced much greater efforts at denial than in coming to terms with history. Omer reports the memories of the past he hears when asking older elders about what happened around Buczacz, and they tend to have these glowing accounts both of how much harmony there was before the evil Germans came in, or perhaps the evil Soviets came in, and talk about all the heroic efforts made by the locals, the Ukrainians and Poles, to come to the aid of their Jewish neighbors. Of course, the subsequent Soviet period in this area plays a role here as well, with an ideologically driven narrative that basically effaces the Jews altogether. But as in so many places of Eastern Europe, where Jews were once a large part of local communities, Omer tells us that in contemporary Buczacz, there are very few traces of the lives of either the lives of the Jews or of their mass murder. I think of places like Salonika. Some of you know Tony Mulhor, former colleague in the history department, who's from the Jewish community in Salonika, which at one point was over half the population of Salonika, an extremely important part of this Greek kind of Mediterranean trading city. And they were all murdered in World War II, and today, apparently, according to his accounts, there's absolutely no trace. Seems to be no consciousness that there were ever Jews there. Finally, what are the implications of this story that is told from Buczacz so masterfully? And by the way, for those of us who work in the kind of easy languages of Western Europe, I certainly am one to credit the difficulty of working through the kind of languages that you had to do this kind of wonderful research. First of all, as we heard, for the Jews of Buczacz, justice never came. As Bartov put it, referring to the murder more generally of Europe's Jews, most of the perpetrators managed to wiggle out of a leaky judicial system and died peacefully in their beds. While he praises the West German courts for doing this investigative work that is, of course, so important for historians, including what we see Omer work with here, he says that the vast majority of those investigated never got prosecuted, let alone convicted or paying any penalty. And I might add that the Italian situation that I know, many thousands of Jews from Italy were deported to their death in Auschwitz, and not a single one has ever been prosecuted. Not a single Italian involved, and this was all accomplished through collaboration by Italians with the Nazis, occupiers. Okay, I'm really reached the end. I won't go on. There's so many points to think about from this book. It gives us much to ponder, very large issues of morality, but also questions of historiography, questions of the use of oral history, which we perhaps have some time to get into. But for all this, we owe a great debt to Omer Bartov. Thank you.
It's a little bit of an obstacle course.
I'm very happy to be here. I've been at Brown and the Watson Institute any number of times, and I always find it very, very engaging intellectually and very interesting. The problem is my last name begins with a W, so I'm always at the end of the line. And by now I should know that I shouldn't bother to write anything up for myself, and I should just wing it. I've actually thought about changing my name to Abramovich, at least for a couple of years. So at least for 2 years in this career, I would get to go first rather than last. All the accolades you have just heard are correct. Omer has written an extraordinary book. I have often thought in the last 10 years, and I've sometimes said to a few people, that there's nothing more to learn about the Holocaust. It's one of the most researched topics that exists in the realm of history. Maybe only second to the American Civil War or something like that. Yeah, there are always new facts, new this, new that one can learn, but we know what happened. We understand the contours of what happened. We're not going to come up with new interpretations. Well, along comes Omer and his book, and I have to say, well, I guess I was wrong. That here is a book that for anyone who teaches, writes, is interested in the Holocaust, one has to read, because it is, on one hand, so harrowing, but it also does raise all sorts of intellectual and historical issues. It is harrowing. It is at times excruciating to read. The perpetrators, all of them, not just Nazis, but Polish nationalists, Ukrainian nationalists, don't just kill, they kill in vicious and sadistic sort of ways. And that tells us something, by the way. The manner of killing tells us something. It's an attempt to obliterate the very presence of the people who are targeted. And it's not just Jews. Polish nationalists do it to Ukrainian nationalists, and Ukrainian nationalists do it to Polish nationalists as well. I mean, like my panelists, I've taught about the Third Reich and the Holocaust. I've taught about genocides. I've read narratives or prosecutorial evidence, for example, from the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And you think you've sort of heard enough, read enough of these kinds of things, and still, one reads Omer's book, and it still is excruciating to read some of these accounts. And, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe if one gets so totally inured to this kind of violence, it's time, at least in our profession, to stop teaching, stop writing about it. So I guess that's a fair warning. Read the book, but it's not going to be a pleasant read in some parts of it. What's extraordinary, there are a number of extraordinary things about it. David just mentioned one. One is the linguistic range that Omer brings to this study. So he has plumbed, and Laura mentioned this also, diaries, memoirs, letters, trial evidence in Hebrew, Yiddish, Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, English. I think that's it. I think I've got it all. German, of course, German. How could I have forgotten German? All of that. I mean, this is very, very impressive. But it's more than that, because he's telling us that if we want to understand this history, we need all of these sources, these multiple kinds of sources in multiple languages. You don't just get, Laura brought up, especially, and again, David too, the historiography on the Holocaust. The book many of us grew up with, Raoul Hilberg's The Destruction of the European Jews. He was very, very clear that he was only going to work through German state documents, was not going to trust the source material of the victims. But Omer shows us that indeed we need those sources, not just from victims, from perpetrators and everybody else who was present at the scene of these killings. One of the other really remarkable achievements of the book is that it situates the Holocaust in the longer history. And that longer history was not the pre-World War I history in particular, was certainly not one, again, my colleagues mentioned this, of the different communities loving one another, hugging one another, and there were periods of horrendous violence from the medieval period on into the late 19th century, but there were also long periods of coexistence. It did not always occur that Ukrainians slaughtered Poles, Poles slaughtered Ukrainians, and all of them slaughtered Jews. The event that seems to break all of this is World War I. And as Omer writes, one can see even in the 2-3 decades before World War I, a coming apart, a fracturing of Buczacz society. The three major communities retreating into themselves, that's a result of the emergence of nationalism. And David brought this up. The destructive force of nationalism, such that these different communities could only see a future for themselves, among themselves, without anyone else who was different. So we see this uneasy trend developing, and then World War I shatters whatever calm there had been. The Russians come, the Habsburgs retake the city, the Russians come back, the Habsburgs retake it. Polish nationalists see an opportunity in this, the chaos of the war. Ukrainian nationalists see an opportunity in the chaos of the war. And the armistice on November 11th, 1918 does not end the violence. It continues, and you have this mix of ethnic, racial, national, class, political violence, not only in Buczacz, but all across the broad swath of territory from the Baltic to the Black Sea. And things, get a little calmer once the Polish state is established. But there is this, coming apart that's already evident in World War I. And I think that's a very, very important argument to make. That is, there is a prehistory to the actual events of the Holocaust. It doesn't just start in 1941. Okay. People are used in a way to, or they have been accustomed in a way to killing, and again, killing with sadistic force as a tool of politics. Now, the power of the book comes through all of the voices that Omer has captured and this really great research accomplishment. And he knows, I think, this. For me, I sometimes missed Omer's voice. When he does, and he does it rarely, enter into an analytical mode, he has a very powerful and eloquent voice, and I wish there was more of it in the book. Now, the first time I heard you present, it was almost 20 years ago. We were, I think 2000, we were at a workshop on genocide in Barcelona, convened by Ben Kiernan and Bob Gilately. So here we are in this lovely Spanish Catalan city, holed up for 4 days talking about genocide. And at night we go out to these lovely dinners, and I remember the one night we were singing Avanti Popolo, the Italian communist song, and a host of other left-wing songs, and the waiters looked at us with amusement and bemusement. I actually remember what I said to you at the time, which I'm not sure why I remember, because sometimes I can't remember what I said 2 weeks ago, but I do remember that I said to you, you need more social science. And by that I meant you need more analysis. It's not just enough to have all of these voices. But I know that's the decision you made. And maybe I'm asking you for a little bit of a different book. And again, I don't want to diminish whatsoever the accomplishment here, because the voices that come through do give us this holistic and also harrowing picture of what happens to Buczacz. But one issue. So is Buczacz typical then for the Holocaust, for other genocides? I think I know the answer. I think I know what I think, and I think I know what Omer thinks too. But I would have liked to have heard something about that. And how then do we explain? And maybe we can't ever really explain this. The ability, again, David quoted this eloquent sentence. There are others like this from Omer. I mean, how do we explain the way people can engage in such horrendous violence, and just very happily go on with their lives afterward. I mean, how do they engage the violence itself? You know, it's a universalistic question. It's a psychological question. I don't think we'll ever have final answers to it, but it does really make you wonder about our human species. And then I also wonder, you know, were alternate pathways ever possible? I mean, Omer certainly does not write a deterministic history, but there is a kind of an arc, and of course we know what's coming during World War II and Nazi rule. I often cite this great article by the historian William Hagen from, I think, 1996, in which he showed that all across Eastern Europe, exception of the Soviet Union, it's an entirely different case, the conditions of Jewish life were deteriorating in the interwar period. So if it's possible, and it's very hard, of course, but if it's possible to imagine Europe, a world without Nazi Germany, the future still looked very, very grim for Jews in Poland, Hungary, Romania, everywhere in Eastern Europe. With the formation of all of these East European nation states after World War I, you know, with their powerful nationalizing force, they all saw Jews as a problem, a huge problem. There was, the minority treaties were forced upon them, but there was no room for Jews really in a Polish national state, in a Romanian national state, in a Hungarian national state. Moreover, the intermediary role that Jews had traditionally played in the economy in this region, there's no room for that either, as these states are all promoting Polish capitalists, Romanian capitalists, and so on. So the situation looks grim no matter what, no matter which way you turn. And does that mean then that the Zionists were correct, that there was no future for Jews in Europe, or at least in Eastern Europe, and that the only way Jewish life could flourish would be in a Jewish state? As someone who is not particularly sympathetic toward nationalists of any stripe, that's a very uncomfortable position, but it's one that, in a sense, Omer's narrative leads us to. So this is a book powerful in all the ways we've described, but it's also a book that raises all sorts of intellectual, political, and moral issues about the Holocaust, but about much else in human life and human history. Thank you.
Thank you very much all for coming, and thank you so much to my panelists and our chair and moderator. There's a term in Hebrew, you say katonti. I'm too small for all this praise, and thank you. I admit that I worked on this book for about 20 years, so although there was one book on the way to this one, it was a sort of stepping stone, really. Well, yeah, but I mean monograph, yes. So I will try to address just some issues in the next 10 minutes because many questions were raised, many issues. It'll be difficult to address all of them, and I'll go more or less in the order of the comments. So I'll start with Laura. I think the one issue that I would like to talk about is what you said right at the end, the trajectory, because to me at least it was interesting, and it was in a sense an intellectual journey, but also an historical journey, and I feel in a sense that I'm still on the way. that I haven't quite finished it, and I don't want to end it in the killing pits of Buczacz. But it started many years ago, even before I started thinking about this book. It started in the late 70s and early 90s, when I asked myself, what was it that motivated young German men who went to fight in Russia to become such murderous brutes, and at the same time to be such effective and highly motivated soldiers. And at the time, this was part of a large historical debate in which the main argument in Germany was still that the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, fought an honorable war, but their shield of honor was stained by the troops behind their backs, the black uniformed SS, the Gestapo, who did horrible things, but that had nothing to do with the brave soldiers who went to fight a war that they did not want to fight and were largely victims of the regime. This, by the way, this line of being victim of the regime, I found in a very large quantity in the trial records that I went through for this book, when even the worst perpetrators, even those who were eventually found guilty of murder, the judges said about them, but one has to say at the same time that they were also victims of the circumstances of their time. And I kept thinking to myself, the judges themselves who were passing these rulings in the late 1950s and early 60s obviously thought of themselves too as victims of the circumstances of their own time. So this was the first question that I asked myself, and in order to address it, I chose to look at a small number of German soldiers to do a kind of local study. And I chose just 3 German combat divisions that were at the front. There was no question that they were not in the back. They were in the front. They were doing the fighting. And I tried to see what they did, what motivated them. And through a concept that I developed for myself of total history of a very small unit, I collected all the documents I could on these 3 divisions. And then I tried to write a kind of social history of those units. And much came out of that explained matters that could not be explained when you looked from the top, when you had an Überblick, as the Germans call it, a view from the top, but rather when you did the Geschichte von unten, when you did a history from below. And you discovered both the normality of these soldiers. They were young men. You discovered where they came from, what sort of education they had, what it was that they expected at the front, what the reality of the front was, which was horrific. And this will get me later to the PTSD question that I find really interesting. And ultimately to what it was that combined this tremendous motivation, because this was, we don't think about that in the United States, but it was the Red Army that destroyed the German army. It was not the US Army or the British Army or the French, it was the Red Army. And what was it that made these young men fight so, with such motivation to the last moment? So this was the beginning of something that already I could trace back to the late 70s and early 80s. Many years later, I started thinking about what it is about genocide, this huge event, this inexplicable event, this phenomenon that we, at least when speaking about the Holocaust, people in the 1980s and 90s, when the Holocaust became into the fore as a main event in European history, as a main event in the history of World War II, which it hadn't been before, that people said is indescribable, is unimaginable, is ineffable, we cannot understand it. And as an historian trained in Britain in empirical history, I didn't buy this terminology. I didn't like this. All events can be explained. The question is, how do you go about doing it? And so I thought maybe I should go back to that early work that I did and try and understand how that happens, not writ large, but in one place, and to see what happens in this one place. And once I started doing that, a lot of other questions came up, many of which were now mentioned in the comments. The question, the relationship between the killers and the victims. The fact that there was none of what we thought was necessary dehumanizing the victims. There was no dehumanization of the victims. In fact, the victims were known by name. There were relationships between Germans and Jews. The Jews knew the Germans knew the Jews before they killed them. They worked as their maids, as their tailors, they took care of their children. It was a community before they killed them. There were no, as was mentioned rightly, there were no bystanders in the sense that we thought until now. You can think of bystanders when you think of Jews, say, living in Grunewald in Berlin, and one day they're rounded up, and their neighbors look through the windows and they see them marching off to the train station with their little suitcases, and then they disappear. They go nach Osten. Those people are looking through the windows. They are supposed to be the bystanders. But in a town like Buczacz, everybody was there. You didn't have to look through your window. It was happening in the street. People were being shot in the street. Children were being thrown out of balconies into the street, and other children were walking to school at the same time. This was the reality of it. So to say that one was a bystander was rather meaningless. And when your neighbors were taken out and shot on the street or brought to the train station or shot in a pit nearby, then their apartment and their property were up for grabs. And somebody had to take over. If you didn't, somebody else did. And so everyone was involved in this general social event. And to call those people bystanders was obviously is not the concept that we had in mind when we spoke previously about bystanders. So in that sense, again, looking at the Holocaust, this unimaginable event from below, you discovered something very different about how it happened, and of course, as was said here, very much also about the fact that while there was an encounter, and there was a human encounter between perpetrators and victims, when the Germans come there, they don't know anything about this place. The German security police comes there to kill the Jews. That's the task they have. And they use whatever they can. They get, they organize a Jewish council, they organize a Jewish police, they take the Ukrainian nationalist militia and turn it into a German auxiliary police, and then they go about killing the Jews. But the dynamic, the social dynamic in the town determines in large part the nature, the manner in which all this happens. And that is a dynamic that the Germans don't care about, but is very much part of how this event takes place and is experienced by the people on the ground. And that's very important to understand, because otherwise we think of this in a sense, through the eyes of the perpetrators who didn't care about it. So one event that was not mentioned in the comments, and I'll just mention it here quickly, is that while the Jewish population was murdered by 20 to 30 German policemen, who altogether were responsible for the murder of 60,000 Jews in this region. And obviously they couldn't do it alone, so they did it with with some 300 Ukrainian policemen and so forth. Once the Jews are killed, or most of them are killed, there's still many around, but they're either in hiding or in labor camps, the Ukrainians start killing the Poles. And the Germans are not interested in that at all. This is violence that is happening separately from the agenda that the Germans have. Sometimes it gets in their way, so they interfere, but most of the time they don't care about this. In this region, the Germans are actually eventually saving Poles from Ukrainians. And there are even some cases in which the Germans, toward the end, are saving Jews from Ukrainians. It was mentioned that toward the end, most of the killing of Jews is by Ukrainians. And there are a couple of Germans who save Jews. That's after the Gestapo is gone already. All these security people who are there, obviously because they don't want to fight at the front. It's much safer to be there than to be at the front. At the front, they die like flies. So they stay there. But when the Red Army gets closer, they leave. And then there are some Wehrmachtsoffizier there. There are some German officers, combat officers. And one of them saves about 600 Jews in a town near Buczacz. And we don't have his name. And the only reason that we know about him is from Jewish testimonies, which is at least one good reason to use testimonies, despite what some historians say. Okay, that's David raised many important questions, and I obviously won't be able to address most of them, but I'll just try to put it in slightly different words, maybe. One thing that I found extraordinary was that when people spoke about what was happening at the time and subsequently, many people said two contradictory things. On the one hand, they said what happened was no one could believe that this would happen in this town. It was impossible to believe that there would be so much violence in this town, that so many people would be murdered in such gruesome ways. And at the same time, the same people said, well, we knew it would happen. It was expected. And I think that tension between the two statements has something to do also with the roots, with the deep roots of inter-ethnic relations, both with the fact that people had for centuries lived side by side, and most of the time with no violence. Between 1700 and 1914, in this area, there's very little violence. In the 17th century, there's a lot of violence. There's wars against the Ottoman Empire, and before that, there's the Cossack uprising, the Khmelnytsky uprising of 1648. There's a huge amount of violence. But in the 18th and 19th century, in this area, there's very little violence. There is growing violent discourse in the latter part of the 19th century, and it's not triggered yet. The violence is only around, I think David was citing this line, it's about who does this place belong to? Does it belong to the Ukrainians, who say they're the indigenous population, and the Poles are their occupiers, colonizers who are using their Jewish lackeys to control them? Does it belong to the Poles who say that they came and brought civilization and culture to this place? They built cities. And the Ukrainians are actually Poles, only they don't know it. They should understand. The Jews don't say it belongs to them. The Jews say, well, we run the shops here. We are doing the commerce. We are doing good things for this place. But they don't claim ownership on the land. So I think the combination of having lived together and never knowing any other existence in towns like this, and there were hundreds of such towns, people never lived apart from each other. There wasn't any moment in history that this was only a Polish town, or only a Jewish town, or only a Ukrainian town. It's just that each group talked about it as a Polish town, a Jewish town, or a Ukrainian town. But in reality, they always lived side by side. The discourse becomes increasingly violent. It's triggered, indeed, in World War I and its immediate aftermath. And the result is that there is this both a habit of living together and a discourse that is then implemented into real violence that makes this tension between we always expected it and how is it possible. So that's a second point. On religion, also hugely interesting issue. I'll say only two things on this. First of all, particularly Ukrainian nationalism, it's not only in Ukraine, but in this region, particularly Ukrainian nationalism is initially the creation of Greek Catholic Ukrainian priests. So nationalism is carried by religion, and religion plays a huge role in the transition from being different groups with different socio-economic roles and speaking slightly different dialects into being national groups. The distinction in this area between Poles and Ukrainians is that Poles are Roman Catholic and Ukrainians are Greek Catholic. Now, if you change religion, you can basically change ethnicity. And there are Poles living in this area who are considered to be indigenous. That is, there's an argument that goes on whether these Roman Catholics who are living there are Poles or Ukrainians, whether you determine them by their ethnicity or by their religion. And of course, as you know, the Habsburg Empire determines identities according to language, and the only language that is not accepted as a language of identity is Yiddish. And so Jews have to choose a language of identity. Initially it's Polish, it's German, and later it's Polish. But what is interesting here, and I'll just say this, in this mix of ethnicities, is that there is also a great deal of intermarriage. Not Jews, but between Poles and Ukrainians. And this intermarriage means in this area, and it's a long tradition, that if a Polish man marries a Ukrainian woman, the sons are raised in the religion of the father and the daughters in the religion of the mother. Which means that over time you maintain, although they're married together, you maintain your ethnicity through your religion. And what happens during World War II, particularly in 43, 44, after most of the Jews are killed, is that there are murders taking place within families. Because the families are partly Ukrainian and partly Polish, and there's some towns, less in Buczacz, but in that area, where most of the population is mixed. So religion plays a huge role. I can say much more about it, but I can't now. On the PTSD question, I want to touch on that for a moment, because I think it is a very interesting question, and I don't have a clear answer, but I would say one thing. The German military, German soldiers, and I spent a long time studying German soldiers, combat soldiers, they definitely had PTSD syndromes. They didn't use that term then, but there was a lot of that. And if you look at the lower level, at the battalion and company level, you have entire companies that are clearly suffering from whatever they called it, battle syndrome, shell shock, PTSD, because they're subjected to horrific killing, dying, exposed to the elements for a very long time. So you have a great deal of that. The difference with these perpetrators is that apart from the killing bouts, they have unlimited food, unlimited alcohol, unlimited tobacco, and unlimited sex. And they live in very nice bucolic environments. Every once in a while, they go and they kill people. And I suspect that makes a big difference. The other element that has to be, and that is most disturbing, I think morally or ethically, is that while it's really hard to find any of these perpetrators expressing any regret or sorrow. Among the victims, everyone is. They're all filled with shame and guilt. When you read these testimonies, it keeps appearing again and again. And again, there are obvious reasons for it, because how did you survive? Around you, people were being killed, your children, your parents, your friends. At some point, you were lucky and survived, and the person next to you didn't. And there were people that you had tried to survive with. So if you want to call it horror, this to me is the morally the most disturbing aspect of it. And if there is a banality of evil, the banality of evil is that the perpetrators never understand, even 20 years later, 30 years later, they never understand what they did. They somehow always say, well, I tried to keep myself apart as long as I could. They have all these lines. The Jews made it easy. I don't understand why they didn't fight against us. They never mentioned that the Jews were surrounded by Ukrainian militia. That's why they couldn't run away. Two other last points I'll make, okay?
Sure.
So one is the issue of neighbors that we talked about, but I want to mention one thing that is important because it didn't come up, and I would like to just mention it, which is that when you look at these events from below, another really important element that comes up quite clearly without any, you don't have to think much about it, is that everybody had a choice. That there was nothing choiceless about it, that everyone had alternatives. That this was not predetermined. So this is not now the predetermined whether nationalism had to lead to the Holocaust, which I don't think it had to. It could have led to all kinds of other bad things, but not necessarily to this. And this was very much a German idea, this specific genocide, not the ethnic cleansing of Poles and Ukrainians, but this. But that in the reality of the town, and this town was obviously is representative of hundreds of such towns, from Lithuania to into Romania, Bessarabia, all these mixed population towns, very similar. You can go one after the other if other people will study them. But that in these towns, with all the horror and all the resentment and all the rage, people make choices all the time. Everyone, including Germans, make choices. As I mentioned, there are a number of Germans who make choices. There are a number of Gestapo officers who make choices. Even as they're killing Jews, they decide one day they're not going to kill one Jewish woman and her 2 children because she's an elegant woman, she speaks good German, and she says, don't kill me today, you can kill us tomorrow. And the guy makes a choice. And now he feels good about it. He feels like now he's a gentleman. He behaved decently. But she, or at least her children, survive. And they remember it as the moment that they survived. So everyone makes choices, and I think we don't always see it when we look from below. And okay, just last point. Eric also raised so many points that it's hard for me to choose, so I'll choose one of them, and I'll choose the one on the last one that Eric mentioned, which is obviously really important. So I referred a little bit to the question of what would have happened had the Nazis not come there. Now, that's, of course, it's counterfactual history. None of us knows what would have happened. We can write a good novel about that. But I think that clearly, as Bill Hagen wrote at the time, clearly the Jews were increasingly unwanted. The masses of Jews in Eastern Europe were increasingly unwanted, and they themselves wanted to leave. Now the question is, was Zionism the only choice? Well, that's another question, and I would say most Jews, and already from the late 19th century, didn't choose Palestine. They chose North America. Between the 1880s and World War I, over 2 million Jews emigrated from Eastern Europe to this country. Most of the Jews living in this country were part of this wave of immigration from Eastern Europe, many of them from Galicia, many of them from these towns, and mostly for economic reasons. They were very poor, and they sought better chances. And they had chain migration, by the way. Right? Because the father would come and then find a home and a job and then bring the family. So many Jews living in this country now are products of chain migration from the late 19th century. But in 1924, as you know, there is a law in the United States which vastly limits immigration of people from Eastern Europe, and particularly Jews. And it becomes increasingly difficult for Jews to immigrate to this country. And with the Depression, more and more countries don't want to have immigrants, and there is a rise in anti-Semitism in many countries that would have been places where Jews would immigrate to, including France, Britain. And at the same time, in 1936, is the Arab uprising in Palestine. And so the much smaller numbers of Jews, Zionists, including my grandfather, who immigrate to Palestine, are doing that with certificates, with immigration certificates. The number of certificates being handed out after 1936 because of the Arab uprising and the change in British policy, Palestine is under British mandate, diminishes. And so they get stuck there. And so what would have happened, my final point would be that Hitler would have found far fewer victims in Europe had the United States kept its gates open in the early 1920s. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. We might, ease into 15 minutes. But let me open it up. Let's start with David.
Thank you all for a wonderful conversation, and thank you, Omer. My maternal grandmother and her family all came from Buczacz. They all emigrated to Canada in the first decade of the 20th century. As I was growing up, not one of them, and there were dozens in Montreal, one big ghetto, not one of them would talk about Buczacz or about the family in Buczacz. My grandfather came from Lemberg, and it was the same with his family. None of them. It is your wonderful book, Erased, brought back to my mind that it was my own family that contributed to the erasure. I learned nothing from them, although I did family trees, tried to get information, nothing. That's one. Two, Professor Weitz mentioned the horrendous impact of the Great War on the collapse of anything like community, no matter what kind of community in Eastern Europe. I just finished reading this book by Alexander Watson, Ring of Steel, that specifically targets Lemberg in many chapters about how every time the Russians captured Lemberg from the Austrians, the Jews got into trouble. They were massacred. They welcomed the return of the Austrian Empire, of the Austrian army, and the same with Czernowitz, and I assume the same with all of the towns in the Bloodlands. Would you tell me to what you think that erasure might have, how you deal with the erasure by Jews of their Jewish past in Eastern Europe?
Yes.
So I'll be really brief. There were actually benevolent societies, several Buczacz benevolent societies. I write about them. I looked up their papers, and they sent money. Once they were established and they could, had some wherewithal, then they sent money to their brethren in Buczacz. But I think that's not so difficult to understand. People left that place and they had to build a new life, and they were usually poor. It was usually very hard. They had to adjust to a new culture, and they just had to concentrate on what there was. I would make an analogy, which has interested me for a long time. Survivors of the Holocaust, we didn't talk about it here, survivors of the Holocaust, say from a town like Buczacz, almost no survivor survived without being helped by Gentiles in that area. One has to understand that. It was almost impossible to survive without somebody helping you, giving you bread, milk, shelter, something. Now, when they came to North America or to Israel, they had to rebuild their lives. And it often took them decades until at some point they thought, but what happened to this Kowalski who saved me? And they started looking for the people who helped them. Usually those people were dead by then, but they found their children. And with the fall of communism, they could also go there and visit them. So I think there's a big gap between coming, either immigrating or coming after such a disaster, rebuilding your life, creating a new life, and then decades later beginning to think, as my generation did, where did we come from?
Yes, please.
You really have to applaud the fact that the studies on genocide is continuing. It needs to be broadened. And the points that were raised by Professor Weitz, there's more need of social science study is very important. And again, by the author, I have to question something on relationship of religion and ethnicity. Regarding the social science, we come to a question of identity. And even as currently we see what's happening to the Rohingya people, because they're Rohingyas, that's why they are erased from the face of the world or pushed out. It's a similar situation in that area, and I think the stress between Poles and Ukrainians is built on that. So the question would be, how could that study on genocide pursue more deeply the issue of on the social issue, on identity? And then to the author, Professor Bartov, I have a question. The fact that I think you pointed made a very important point, and that this is, I think, Europe of the past, where state and religion were united, and I think that's why the American Constitution is so strong and validates that it has to be separated. So, what was the role, as you must have come across, of Metropolitan Andrew Sheptytsky, head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, and I have to say, I'm a daughter of a Greek Catholic priest who was in concentration camp simply because on the identity issue, he taught religion in the Ukrainian language.
I'm not so sure well, this is in the realm of social science, but I think we do know from other cases of genocide, from the Armenian genocide, what's going on with the Rohingya today, that is, as soon as a particular group is targeted as the enemy for whatever reason, and every member of that group is seen to be the enemy no matter whatever he or she does, then we are certainly in very dangerous circumstances. And I think that at least we have learned, if we didn't know it before, we've certainly learned it over the last 25 years or 20 years from all the work in comparative genocide studies. And one can go, case after case after case and see that kind of marginalization of groups, with, again, Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians in the Ottoman Empire, Jews in Eastern Europe, Rohingya, Bosnian Muslims, in the decomposition of Yugoslavia. And I think that always has to be the warning signal for anyone who believes in a democratic society that as part of democracy is necessarily open to people of various ethnicities and religions.
I'm just going to have to keep it to one question because we have, I want to see if we have time for others. We're almost at the end of time. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, just one thing. So I think that the example you give is a very interesting one. Andrzej Szeptycki, as you probably know, was Polish. His brother was a general in the Polish army, and he chose to be Ukrainian and was a metropolitan, and a renowned metropolitan for decades in Lemberg, Lviv. When the Germans marched in July 1941, he welcomed them because he was against the Soviet rule from 39 to 41. And he was a very strong Ukrainian nationalist. Some months later, he made a very important sermon against the Ukrainians, militias who were collaborating with the Germans in killing Jews, and spoke very strongly against the murder of Jews, and in fact reported that to the Pope, who didn't pay much attention to that. After the war, he was deported by the Soviets between 39 and 41, and he died in 44, I think. So he has remained a very complicated figure. He also sheltered Jews himself and ordered other priests to shelter Jews. Now, some did, and some didn't. There were many priests who were very strong nationalists and were part of the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, and there were others who were doing what they had been told by the Metropolitan to do. So it's a very complicated case. It tells you both about the different moral stances taken by people and about the fluidity of ethnicity in that area.
Unfortunately have to say, I think we've come to the end of our time at 6:30. I believe there are books for sale out in the lobby, so for those of you who haven't had a chance to read it, I urge you to do so. I'd just like to take a moment to thank our visiting panelists and, of course, our local panelist and our esteemed author. Thank you so much for coming.